Hey friends, this is Scott Clem here. I am the state representative for House District 31 and also serve as a pastor here in Gillette, Wyoming. And I wanted to give you an update on some of the happenings that are going on with the coronavirus and the state response to all of this. Well, as of this last Friday, I was tipped off to a potential ordinance that was going to be circling around Wyoming cities, and it was going to start in Cheyenne. And the ordinance essentially put an enforcement mechanism on the statewide orders issued by the governor and state health officer, as far as the no gathering ban of 10 or more, certain businesses being closed down, and those things. As of right now, it appears that police and county prosecutors and whatnot have not been citing people for breaking the governor's orders. It is noteworthy that in Title 35, which I'll show you in just a few moments, that anyone who does violate these orders is subject to a misdemeanor and a potential fine, and also jail time, I believe, as well. And so state police have not been enforcing this, but the issue is that you have some really, I would call, tyrannical people. A tyrannical mayor in Cheyenne, Mayor Orr in Cheyenne. She's tyrannical and is wanting everybody to stay home. She's snooping on businesses, or asking people to snoop on businesses to make sure that they abide by this order. And as the mayor of her town, which she rightfully can, is really wanting the police there to enforce this as far as a misdemeanor. Well, so this brings us up to speed as far as, well, what does this new order, as far as this new ordinance, have to do with what's going on down there? Well, in an effort to really kind of inch back some of the authority away from this tyrannical mayor and not charge people with misdemeanors, some on that city council felt it was better to try to walk back the enforcement, and instead of having a criminal fine or a criminal charge, that it would walk it back to a civil fine. And so you would not be charged with a misdemeanor, but you would be charged with some kind of civil fine, which I believe starts out at about $50 and works its way up to $200, depending on how many times a person decides to go ahead and break this order. And so really politics is at play here, because you have some on that council who are wanting to inch back what this tyrannical mayor is trying to do. Personally, I think it's all wrong, and I think it all sends the wrong signal. And since we do not have police that are out there enforcing these measures right now, I think it would be ill-advised for any council to go ahead and put these ordinances into effect and start fining people for being employed. And that's essentially what it is. It's penalizing people for being employed and going to work. And I guess that's more dangerous than the coronavirus, going to work and being employed, and so you're going to be fined. And so really, what we have is tyranny. This is what tyranny looks like. Many people, including myself, we haven't seen tyranny like this, at least in America, what we have now. And what are we going to do about it? You say, well, how is it tyranny? Isn't the state have as a vested interest in this? Aren't there state statutes that address this? And so I'm glad you asked. And so we're going to go ahead and take a look at some of those things. I'd like to bring to your attention, I'm going to show you a few things, first of all, in a PowerPoint that I went ahead and brought up or made up. And what this is going to do is it's going to show you at least some constitutional provisions, both in the US Constitution and also in the state constitution, as far as what are our rights. Because we are a nation that has given expansive rights to the people, not the government. We have limited the power of government, we have enumerated its powers, and we have given expansive freedoms to the people. And so is what we're seeing today constitutional, as far as actually forcing businesses to shut down and say you cannot engage in business, and it's more dangerous for you to be employed, and we're going to fine you if you're employed? And I believe it's not constitutional. So let me show you a few of these things. I'm going to go ahead and bring up, first of all, the US Constitution here. And you're going to see, of course, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion And I've got to underline, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That means worship. In other words, our nation doesn't get to tell churches what is appropriate worship and what is not appropriate worship, or how to worship, or when to worship, or who gets to worship, or anything like that, because worship is not something that is sanctioned by the state. Worship is something that is sanctioned by the church. And there's only one authority that the church answers to, and that's the Lord Jesus Christ. It goes on and it says they're abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or, notice here, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble. In other words, you have the right to assemble peaceably with other people, whether that's in protest or for other means. And the government doesn't get to tell you necessarily what to do when it comes to that. Oops, I lost my PowerPoint here. Let me get back up. So let's see what else it says. Article 1, Section 7, this is, of course, the Wyoming Constitution. What we're looking at says this: absolute, arbitrary power over the lives, liberty, and property of freemen exists nowhere in a republic, not even in the largest majority. And of course, this is pertinent even today, because what we have today is, and you're going to see another constitutional measure that says all laws have to be uniform. In other words, we can't create special legislation and say, well, some laws apply to some businesses and some laws don't apply. In other words, it's got to be uniform across the board. If you're going to shut down business and commerce, you got to shut everybody down. You can't pick and choose who's going to stay open. Why? Because that's absolute and arbitrary power. And of course, our Constitution forbids that, saying that this kind of power over the lives, liberty, and property of free men does not exist in our republic. In other words, it's unconstitutional. We have to ask ourselves the question, what makes a dentist office, and I believe dentist offices are open in Wyoming, where people are working inside of people's mouths, and of course we know how disease spreads. What makes that less dangerous than a hairdresser? Because we've shut down hairdressers across the state. Or what makes, for instance, assembling at a church for worship more dangerous than going to a grocery store, where, by the way, everybody in the world, it seems, is allowed to go. That's the one place, at least in Wyoming, that everybody is allowed to go. And it really does seem, from an epidemiological standpoint, that if you wanted disease to spread, you would direct people to a single enclosed location and let them go there repeatedly, and that's what we're doing for grocery stores. So in other words, it's arbitrary. We don't have any scientific data. This is absolute and arbitrary power, and it's an abuse of power. It's tyranny. Of course, Article 1, Section 18, religious liberty and being a pastor. Of course, this is near and dear to my heart as far as these religious rights and liberties that we have. And our Wyoming Constitution says that the free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship without discrimination or preference shall be ever guaranteed in this state. And so I certainly appreciate that. And of course, elsewhere in the Constitution, in Article 21, Section 25, it goes on to say this: perfect toleration of religious sentiment shall be secured, and no inhabitant of this state shall ever be molested in person or property on account of his or her mode of religious worship. And again, worship is something that is determined by churches. When to worship, how to worship, who gets to worship, all of that is determined by churches, not the state. And of course, our Constitution guarantees that. Article 1, Section 21, the right to petition and peaceably assemble. This is the equivalent in our Wyoming Constitution that we see in the US Constitution, the right of petition and of the people peaceably to assemble, to consult for the common good, and to make known their opinions shall never be denied or abridged. In other words, you and I have the right, according to the Constitution, to assemble for the common good, to make known our opinions, etc. And of course, this is not to be denied, nor is it to be abridged. We're going to see elsewhere here in the Constitution some restrictions upon that, and for public health, and what our Wyoming statutes have to say about this. But the point is these are constitutional rights that aren't just taken away. In other words, just because there's a pandemic, or just because there's things that happen that potentially put people at risk as far as safety, doesn't mean that our constitutional rights are suspended or gone away. All right? That doesn't work that way. In order for you to have your constitutional rights taken away, you have to go through due process. By the way, again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't pretend to be a lawyer. I'm just a legislator, and I'm showing you some of the things from our Constitution and how I see things. And so with that said, let's go on. Goes on and it says this in Article 1, Section 34, uniform operation of general law. All laws of a general nature shall have uniform operation. In other words, if businesses need to close down, it means all businesses need to close down. Okay, you can't just keep some up open because of some arbitrary notion. Article 1, Section 36, rights not enumerated are reserved to the people. The enumeration in this Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny, impair, or disparage others retained by the people. In other words, who has the right to expansive freedoms? Government or the people? It's the people. We have the right to those freedoms. It goes on and it says this in Article 1, Section 37, that the Constitution, the state of Wyoming is an inseparable part of the federal union, and the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land. So where there's a conflict of the state law or the state constitution with the federal one trumps the state. That's all that's saying there. And then finally here, Article 1, Section 38, this is the right to healthcare access. And of course, many different points here, but let's look at some of them. First is each competent adult shall have the right to make his or her own healthcare decisions. That's right, you get to decide what those healthcare decisions are, not the state. Goes on, look at point C. The legislature may determine reasonable and necessary restrictions on the rights granted under this section to protect the health and general welfare of the people. And of course, we do have some of those restrictions. We're going to look at those here in just a moment. And then finally, point D is, and it's kind of cut off there by my picture, but the state of Wyoming shall act to preserve these rights from undue governmental infringement. In other words, it has to be the least restrictive thing necessary as far as healthcare access and keeping people safe, etc. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, is the least restrictive things being employed here at this time? So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to bring you to the attention of our state statutes here. Let me transition over to that. And here's some powers in regards to the state health officer. Of course, you saw that in our Wyoming Constitution, where it says the legislature can go ahead and put together some reasonable regulations and whatnot for the benefit of the people. And of course, your state legislature has done that throughout the years. So what does the state statutes have to say in regards particularly to things like pandemics and whatnot? So I'd like you to see this. Of course, this is powers and duties, and this is to the Department of Health and the state health officer. I'm just going to go ahead and read some of this so you can see this here for yourself. The Department of Health, through the state health officer or under his direction and supervision, through the employees of the department, shall have exercised the following powers and duties. And so here's some of those powers and duties that we're going to discover here. Notice what it says in point number 2. It says to investigate and control the causes of epidemic, endemic, communicable, occupational, and other diseases and afflictions and physical disabilities resulting therefrom affecting the public health. And so that is a power that our state health officer has, and certainly that person is trying to keep us safe. Point number 3 says this. Let me scroll up here so you can see it a little better. It says to establish, maintain, and enforce isolation and quarantine. Now, if you've been involved in politics in any amount of time, you know that words matter and definitions matter. And one of the things that you're going to see here in a little bit is we do have the definition of quarantine found elsewhere in statutes. I can't find where we have any definition as far as isolation. By and large, what that means, though, is quarantine refers to those sick individuals in which they can be quarantined or kept separate from the general population, whereas isolation is more the mechanism of keeping healthy folks separated from one another. Of course, that's my definition of it, but I can't necessarily find that in state statute as far as what the word isolation means. Definitions, words matter. Goes on to say this, though, to establish, maintain, and enforce isolation and quarantine, and in pursuance thereof, and for such purpose only, to exercise such physical control over property and over the persons of the people within this state as the health officer may find necessary for the protection of the public health. So pretty broad powers there as far as what we see the state health officer can do in keeping the public health as far as our safety is concerned in mind. And so that we see some of those things that they can do as far as exercising physical control over property, etc. and over persons. Well, what is that exactly? Does that mean? Again, we can't just be left to our own imagination. We do find that state statute narrows these things even more, and so we're going to see that. Notice point 4 here, as far as what some of the powers are. Goes on and it says to close theaters, schools, and other public places, and to forbid gatherings of people when necessary to protect the public health. So what does that mean? Well, it means exactly that. I guess they can close theaters, schools, etc. But it goes on and it says, or other public places. So the question is, are those other public places private businesses? Are private businesses considered public places? What's a nuance here? We don't really have that necessarily in the law or really defined for us. We do see that theaters and schools, and we know we have public schools, those kind of things can be closed, which really they are in a sense public. But what about a private business? Does the state health officer or our governor, do they have the power in state law to go ahead and shut down private businesses? I would contend that they can't. It says other public places. And public places does not necessarily mean private businesses, or for that matter, private residences where you're maybe doing business out of your private residence. And it says, and to forbid gatherings of people when necessary to protect the public health. Okay, so they can forbid public gatherings, and we've seen that happen as far as this gathering ban of 10 or more people. But what is this limited to, right? I mean, of course, we've got families who probably have more than 10 people here in Wyoming who are living together. Are they in violation of the law? Does this apply to a private residence? What are the limitations here? And that's really the question that I'd like for you to start thinking about, or what is the limitations, in keeping in mind the backdrop of our constitutional rights. Now, one thing that you need to remember is this is state statute right here that we're looking at. And state statute is subservient to the Wyoming and Wyoming and US constitutions. In other words, there's a hierarchy here. You've got state statute. They're all law and they're all enforceable, but you've got state statute, you've got the Wyoming Constitution, and then you've got the US Constitution. And when there are conflicts with state statute, with the Wyoming Constitution or the US Constitution, which one wins? Well, the U.S. Constitution or the Wyoming Constitution. And as we saw just a moment ago, you and I are given some very specific, or let me back it up. The government is given some very specific enumerated powers, and we are entrusted with expansive freedoms. And so we have to ask ourselves, does government have the right to take away some of these freedoms, and what things are spelled out? I'd like to bring to your attention another portion of the state statute here. And again, I think this is just things for you to start thinking about. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer. I'll say that again, and I'm not giving anybody any kind of legal advice. That being said, you don't need to be a lawyer to figure out what the law says, right? I think everybody understands when, that we should not kill or we shouldn't steal, those kind of things, and we read that in state law. It's not, we can have the excuse and say, well, I really didn't understand the law. I wasn't sure, I'm not a lawyer and I can't say, what does killing mean? Or, stealing. I guess I can't figure that out because I'm not a lawyer. It's not like that. And it's not like that with other state statutes as well. Just because you're not a lawyer and I'm not a lawyer doesn't mean that we can't read and look at these things intelligently. And of course, lawyers and judges and all those people in courts, they get to bicker over these things and decide what is actually legitimate and what isn't, as far as the interpretation thereof. Let's look here as far as the state health officer and communicable diseases, this section here. This is in 35.4, 101, and it goes down through several statutes, and we won't go through all of them, but I do want to bring to your attention some of these things that you can see what they say. So again, as far as our government response, you can determine, are some of these things legitimate? And indeed, I do believe some of the government response is legitimate. However, does some of it go overboard? And does it infringe upon our rights and our liberties? And I think we have to ask that question. And in those cases where government is being tyrannical and is infringing upon our liberties and our freedoms, our expansive freedoms, and is not abiding within its enumerated powers, then anything that it does that is repugnant to the Constitution, such as an ordinance here that we have that's going to be debated here tonight in the city of Cheyenne or elsewhere around Wyoming, when you have such ordinances that are repugnant to the Constitution, then it really is incumbent upon the people at that point to rise up and, for the good of the Constitution, to practice civil disobedience. And I think that has to happen. That's me personally. Notice what it says in 35.4.101. It says the state Department of Health shall have the power to prescribe rules and regulations for the management and control of communicable diseases. Any person violating or refusing to obey such rules and regulations, or resisting or interfering with any officer or agent of the State Department of Health while in the performance of his duties, shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor, and upon conviction thereof shall be punished by the imposition of a penalty that may be provided by law or at the discretion of the court. Said person may be punished by a fine of not more than $100 or imprisonment not exceeding 30 days, or both fine and imprisonment. So in other words, these things are enforceable as far as these executive orders that the governor has put into place. And if you violate these things, then you are subject to a misdemeanor, a fine, and or jail time. So some serious things, and of course this is why what's going on as far as this ordinance, and I understand the politics of this as far as this potential ordinance that's going on in Cheyenne. What's the purpose of it? The purpose is to lessen it, to make it not a misdemeanor. And I think you'll find that police officers would probably rather give a fine rather than charge someone with a misdemeanor. And so that's the politics behind all of this. Again, I don't like either one, and since we're not really enforcing state law as far as some of these misdemeanors, at least to my knowledge, I haven't heard of that. Maybe it is happening, but I haven't heard of it. I think it's ill-advised to go ahead and start instituting a fine, because I think you'll see a lot more people get fines. And I don't think that's right. I think that's tyranny. Let's go on and see what else it says here. Notice what it says, 35.4.103. This is investigation of diseases, quarantine, regulation of travel, employment of police powers to enforce quarantine, report of county health officer supplies and expenses. And so this is an important section right here. If you get a chance, you can go ahead and check this out. By the way, you can find this at wyoleg.gov, and you can look at our state statutes here in 35.4.103, and you can look at the rest of this section as well. But I want you to pay close attention, because again, the language matters, and one of the things that we have to consider here, we have to consider what it says as far as this issue of quarantine versus isolation. Again, I'm going to show you at the very end here of this section. It does give the definition of quarantine. We don't have the definition of isolation. And what we do know about quarantine is in reference to those individuals who have been infected or have been around individuals who have been infected with a communicable disease. So in other words, if you haven't been around a person who has this disease, or you're not infected yourself, then you're not quote unquote quarantined. You have self-isolation. So notice what it says here. The Department of Health shall, immediately after the receipt of information that there is any smallpox, cholera, scarlet fever, diphtheria, or other infectious or contagious disease which is a menace to the public health, or any portion of the state or order of the county health officer, to immediately investigate the case and report it to the state health officer, the results of the investigation. State health officer subject to Wyoming Statute 35.4.112. And if in his judgment the occasion requires, direct any county health officers to declare, to declare the infected place to be in quarantine. In other words, it's got to be infected, and a quarantine applies. Then it goes on and talks about the county health officer, and certain restrictions that can be taken as far as the locality and all of that kind of stuff. Notice what it says. Let's see if I can go down here and find a little bit more. I found some of these things that are very interesting, as far as the state health officer can go ahead and, as far as maintaining a state quarantine, enforce practical regulations, and kind of see that here, kind of do that. Shall enforce practical regulations regarding railroads or other lines of travel into or out of the state of Wyoming, as necessary for protection of the public health. And then I noticed this next part here, which I thought was also interesting. The expenses incurred in maintaining the state quarantine shall be paid out of funds out of the state treasury appropriated for this purpose, and a manner in which other expenses of the department are audited and paid. In other words, these expenses for quarantining, which I would conclude also would be expenses to to businesses who have been forced to close in this instance. Who's on the hook to pay for those things? It's the state. It's the state. At least that's my reading of it. We go on and we see other regulations that this person can make. The county health officer or with the department may employ a sufficient number of police officers who shall be under the control of the county health officer. And of course, that's what we see here going on in Casper. You have, again, I think people who are ignorant of the Wyoming and US constitutions who want to go absolutely overboard and really it's tyranny. But you have the county health officer over in Natrona County, and you have the mayor of Cheyenne, who are both wanting to they're wanting the state police, they're wanting county police, police within the state. They're wanting them to go out and enforce this with misdemeanors, charging people with misdemeanors, giving them fines, and giving them jail time. And again, there's many people out there, and I want to applaud those elected officials who are standing strong, because there's many elected officials who are standing strong, whether it's in Cheyenne or whether it's in Casper, who are saying, wait a second, we don't want to go ahead and charge people with misdemeanors. Hence this whole political thing about walking this back and having a civil fine and getting rid of the misdemeanor portion of it to enforce this. There was something else here, but you can read through all of these different things as far as quarantines and all that. Of course, you've got quarantine regulations, generally modification. We'll just read a little bit of this. It says, in case of an existence of smallpox, cholera, typhoid fever, scarlet fever, diphtheria, or any infectious or contagious disease, including venereal diseases, that is a menace to public health, i.e., I guess it could be gonorrhea too, or any other epidemic of any such disease, the state health officer may, if he deems proper, proceed to the locality where the disease exists and make such an investigation as is necessary to ascertain the cause thereof. And in the case of quarantine established by a county health officer, the state health officer shall have power after close personal inspection to modify, abrogate any or all quarantine regulations that have been made or established. So we see some of those powers. Now I'd like to take you down here. We'll kind of close with this. I know it's been a long video already, and for those that have stuck with it, I applaud you for that. But notice here some of the definitions, and this is definitions that are used as far as a public health emergency. What is that? It means an occurrence or imminent threat or of an illness or health condition caused by an epidemic or pandemic disease, a novel or highly fatal infectious agent or biological toxin that poses a substantial risk of a significant number of human fatalities or incidents of permanent or long-term disability. The governor shall declare when a public health emergency exists or has ended. And of course, our governor has done that. And by no means in going through all of this are we saying that this disease that we're dealing with today, we're not saying that it isn't risky. We're not saying that it isn't dangerous. I think the one thing that we have to remember is how we battle against this disease. There are certain limitations. There are constitutional limitations put in place, and we don't have the privilege, nor should we. It's not really a privilege to act like China, but we don't get to act like China. Okay, they're an authoritarian, draconian government. They rule with an iron fist, and it's the government there that has the power, not the people. And of course, that's how many countries have responded to all of this. They've responded instead with draconian measures, acting like China instead of what I would call the Swedish model. You look at Sweden and how Sweden has done things. It hasn't closed down business. It's let people be free. It's let people be smart. It's warned about the dangers of this. It's taken necessary precautions. It hasn't minimized or trivialized any of this, and I'm not saying that we should do that either, but I'm saying that we have a constitution to abide by, and we better start abiding by it. And if we don't, or there are elected officials who don't, and they're acting like tyrants, employing tyranny upon the people, then it is incumbent upon the people of Wyoming or the people of the United States to rise up and to practice civil disobedience for the good of the Constitution to any law that is repugnant to the Constitution. And you do not need to be a lawyer to figure out whether a law is repugnant to the Constitution or not. Going on, the last thing here, you can see what quarantine means. And of course, I mentioned earlier that we do have the definition for quarantine. We really don't have the definition that I can find anyway. Not to say it isn't in here, but I didn't find it as far as what does it mean to isolate. But quarantine means this. I would figure it would be in this section, but I don't see it. Quarantine means, of course, we got the physical separation, and we've the physical separation and confinement of an individual or group of individuals that has been or may have been exposed to or is reasonably believed to be infected with a contagious or possibly contagious disease from non-quarantine individuals to prevent or limit the transmission of the disease to non-quarantine individuals. In other words, this has to do with sick people or those who are potentially sick, not with healthy individuals. And so what we see across the United States and even in Wyoming, where we have quarantined not only sick individuals but healthy individuals, is something new in our country, and is something very dangerous because it's trumping on people's constitutional rights, and it's not complying with what I believe is the spirit of the law here. Notice what it says here in point B. The isolation of a geographic area where individuals are located who have been or reasonably believed to have been exposed to an infectious disease by a contagious or possibly contagious disease. So in other words, if one town, if you had some kind of aerosol or something and you believe the whole town is going to get sick or reasonably can get sick, you try to keep those people in that area versus letting them travel around the state. And in that instance, it would be warranted to make sure that an entire place was quarantined to prevent the spread of the disease. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about here, because we can't reasonably suspect that everybody in the state is infected or has come in contact with a person who is infected. In other words, there's this difference between those who are sick or potentially sick and those who are healthy, and we need to maintain that difference. And then finally, point C here, the physical separation and confinement of an individual or group of individuals, or the isolation of a geographic area where a public health emergency of known effect has occurred or reasonably believed to have occurred. So here we have the definition again of quarantine. We don't have the definition of self-isolation or isolation, which again would apply to healthy individuals, not to necessarily to sick individuals. So with all that, I hope this was helpful to you as far as understanding what some of these things are as far as the Constitution and what the law actually says in Wyoming, and not just taking somebody else's word for it. And finally, in consideration of your constitutional rights and some of these wild ideas that are happening out here in the world in regards to this potential ordinance that's going around. Again, I made this video really with that kind of in mind, what's going on in the city of Cheyenne and what's going on in other places. And it really is, you have tyrannical individuals, the county health officer in Natrona County, the mayor in Cheyenne, who does not respect your constitutional rights, who does not respect private property rights. They have good intentions, I would say, as far as they're wanting to keep individuals safe. But again, the Constitution does not allow for its suspension in order to keep people safe. It doesn't work that way. Not in a free society where people are entrusted with expansive freedoms. And so hopefully this will pique your interest a little bit more. I'd encourage you to go into those state statutes. You can look those things up yourself, and then be on guard for freedom. Be on watch, because if you're not watching, this is our moment. It really is our moment. And if we're not watching for our own freedoms and for our own livelihoods, and of course, I haven't even touched on the whole economic side of things, which I've been beating that drum for a while, saying that we are doing more damage when it comes to the economy. And there's real physical harm associated with a down economy as far as people dying. And haven't really touched on that here. That wasn't the purpose of this video. The purpose really is we have to be on guard about our freedoms. And if we don't, then you're going to have your freedoms taken away. Freedom isn't free. It costs people something. And sometimes that means standing up against a tyrannical government, even at your own cost. And later on, things can settle down, but practicing civil disobedience is not easy. It comes at a cost, but sometimes that's worth it for freedom. And so I would ask you to consider these things, and you do what you think is best as far as the cause of freedom is concerned. Thank you again, and appreciate your time.